Welcome, listeners and watchers, to the Fuck the Silos podcast with your host here, Lawrence Yang. I'm a family doctor in Surrey, and we're chatting with nurses today and nurse leaders. Angela, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Thanks so much, Lawrence. I'm delighted to be here with you and your listeners. I am Angela Wignall, and I'm joining today from the unceded homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, on what is today known as Victoria, British Columbia. I am a registered nurse with a practice background in perinatal and public health. And today I serve as the Director of Professional Practice and Health Policy with the Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of British Columbia. And I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, focusing on nursing leadership in health systems. Really delighted to be with you today.
Wow, that's an amazing intro. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, and what an ideal person to be on this in this chat with your background in nursing and leadership and health systems improvement. I want to thank Val. Val, thank you so much for inviting Angela to come and talk to us. Val, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Certainly, and I'm apologizing for not being on camera. My name is Valerie Rzepka, and I'm a primary healthcare nurse practitioner. I currently live, work, and play on the unceded territories of the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in Toronto, Ontario. I am a Global Nurse Leadership Institute scholar from the International Council of Nurses and the former Chief Nursing Officer of Nunavut.
Wow, thank you again, Val. It was so much experience that we have here on the call. I didn't acknowledge my territory. I'm here, and I was born here on the unceded and traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, the Kwantlen, the Katzie, the Kaikait, and some other Coast Salish peoples. And I thank you guys for acknowledging where you're calling in from. And we get a moment then to reflect on how we can each in our own way contribute to some of that reconciliation that is so needed. One of the reasons I have you guys here on the call, and again, so awesome that you guys came on a moment's notice, was I want you to speak to the current state of nursing around the province, in the context that you're aware of. In Surrey, there's a real big challenge in adequate staffing of nurses in the hospital wards, especially. And it's causing a lot of spillover effects where people are feeling like the teams aren't adequately resourced with people. And we're concerned about quality of care and stuff like that. And people are really feeling burnt out, and it's so hard to find any semblance of joy in work. But joy in work is really what we hope for. Angela, why don't you speak first? What's some of the context that you've been noticing where you are?
Yeah, it's a great question and timely, certainly. Nurses are not immune to the current challenges in healthcare. Sometimes people refer to nursing as the backbone of healthcare. I prefer to think of it as the heartbeat of healthcare. Nurses are the largest workforce in the healthcare sector on the planet. We are also the largest number of self-regulating autonomous care providers in British Columbia, with over 60,000 nurses practicing in BC today. And what I hear from nurses regularly, and certainly my own lived experience, is that the crisis in staffing, the HHR crisis or the nursing shortage, is not new. Nursing has been writing about both the existing nursing shortage and the anticipated nursing shortage at around this time due to population dynamics for at least 2 decades. And then COVID-19 happened. And all of the things that we knew were gaps, all of the challenges, the cracks in the system were exposed and exacerbated by the stress of the pandemic response. And so now we have an anticipated challenge coupled with the aftermath of a crisis. And that is showing up in a huge multitude of ways. It's showing up in, as you say, short staffing. It's showing up in an absence of actual human beings to care for other human beings. It's also showing up as mental distress, moral distress, burnout, exhaustion. We have documented evidence that today nurses are more likely to consider leaving their jobs. There are more nurses who are experiencing mental distress bordering on diagnosable PTSD than ever before in the workforce. And we also know that despite all of these challenges, every single day, nurses show up to care for patients. So in the context of a health human resource crisis, in the context of housing inflation, increased costs of living, insufficient and unsafe work environments, nurses continue to show up to care for British Columbians. So I would say that that is a synopsis of some of what we're up against, but also some of the resilience and the hope that I have for nursing in the province.
Thank you, Angela. So there are a lot of factors, like just the cost of living in many cities in Canada just really drives people to have to work, even if the work environments feel toxic because of the volume of work that is demanded of us. And I also want to speak to the ethos of nursing, of being such deep, caring professionals that it drives people to sometimes overcommit themselves beyond their healthy boundaries to continue to work. Valerie, I'm curious, does any of that resonate? What Angela shared, and does that resonate with your experience?
Absolutely, it does. And especially in the context of my professional background, which is primarily rural and remote nursing, particularly in the Arctic and subarctic in Northern Ontario, Northern Alberta, North Manitoba. It is extremely difficult to staff the nursing stations in some of these remote communities. It's quite a commitment to be able to uproot your life and leave your home and your family for weeks at a time, sometimes months at a time, to be able to come to work. And when you are at work, you are on. And when you're not at work, you're still on because you're on call 24 hours. And oftentimes, if there's a crisis that's happening in the community, you are intimately involved with this crisis. So, the level of burnout and the level of exhaustion is across the board, and it ranges from coast to coast to coast. And it's not unique just to the urban settings in the high demand, high paced urban settings, but also in the rural and remote settings as well.
You've highlighted that there's a sense of responsibility that's almost constant. There is almost no real time off for many of these nurses. Is that the sense?
Absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah.
Because you can leave work, but the work will never leave you. And you know that if you are leaving your shift short staffed, when you come back, the ramifications of that short staffing will come back to you at your next shift. And that is illustrated in patient outcomes.
And the ramifications, you're talking about like just people not getting the care they need and then morbidity is increasing, or are you talking about just backlog of work? Or are you talking about
All of
both?
it, all of
All.
the above.
Mm. Now, Val, are you noticing any restrictive rules or regulations around staffing or around the ability to swap shifts or ability to take time off that are,
So
yeah.
in my context, I work in a different context than most nurses do. I work in remote nursing stations where your shift really is a contract, which is anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks at a time. And so being able to leave your shift means you have to leave the community without the staffing that they need. And so trying to find somebody to replace you if you have a family emergency to come home to, that is a huge challenge. And some of the rules around being able to take time off, it really depends on the employer. And I've heard multiple times of various employers um, granting time, their vacation time, and then rescinding it at the last minute because they couldn't find somebody to cover those shifts. Angela, I'm not sure if you've heard of similar instances, but this is definitely something that's come up, especially over the last few years. But it's not been unusual over the last decade or so.
Wow, Val. Before I pass it to Angela, I'd just like to uh, highlight what I think I heard you say. You said that even if you think you're about to take a vacation, that could be taken away from you because of lack of coverage.
I've heard it happen. Yes.
Wow. And then you also said that some nurses have to sacrifice their ability to be with their families at an important event, like a wedding or a funeral
Hmm.
or something, because there's not enough people to cover your shift. So yeah.
I've heard on a number of occasions where nurses will submit their resignation if they weren't able to get the time off that they needed, and the level of frustration is insurmountable at that point.
Yeah, so they actually leave the workforce because of that
Hmm.
inflexibility.
Yeah, and nurses are not just leaving unhealthy or toxic workplaces; they're actually leaving the profession altogether, and that's the most tragic piece.
Yeah, we're losing really caring, really smart, intelligent people who really want to help because the workplace doesn't have enough shift flexibility.
Well, and
And
not only that, but we're losing skilled nurses that are highly educated, who can act as mentors to the new graduates and the younger nurses, to be able to provide that mentorship. And those are the nurses that we're losing. And so this is where Angela and I have worked together on a number of different projects around nurse retention. Recruitment is very important, but retention, in my opinion, is even more important.
because you're retaining that wisdom, the wisdom
Exactly.
that
The,
cannot
in,
come from a book. Yeah.
the
That
institutional knowledge,
institutional
yes.
knowledge too, right? So what those nurses know about how to navigate the system, how to move patients through complexity. Lawrence, that healthcare is not a straight line, no matter where you enter. And 9 times out of 10, it is a nurse alongside a patient, family, or community navigating that complexity. And our new graduate nurses are extraordinary. They're stepping into healthcare at a time when most people wouldn't envy the career ahead of them, and they're doing it with enthusiasm and with joy and with caring. But they have a lot to learn, just like I did when I was a new graduate nurse. And so having that institutional knowledge, that mentorship, that collective memory of how to navigate the complexity of healthcare is also being lost. And Val, to pick up on a thread that I think you brought forward in a beautiful way, we hear a lot in the news about agency nursing and about nurses going to private employers to be employed by the publicly funded health system at a significantly higher cost, because their agencies receive funds as well as the nurse themselves directly. And what we've heard from nurses all across the country, from coast to coast to coast, is that yes, money is important. We all need to feed, clothe ourselves, particularly in this moment in time where things are more expensive. But what's really driving them out is the inflexibility and the safety in their practice environments. And so nurses
100%.
are
Yeah.
choosing to move into agency employment because they have flexible scheduling, because they have the capacity to say no to something, if they need to, for a personal or a family reason. And that is costing the publicly funded healthcare system an enormous amount of money, not to attend to the actual real needs of nurses in the workforce. And those are the same if it's private or if it's public, but the public will pay for it in either way. So governments need to act to create safe practice environments, to create supportive wages, so the nurses aren't forced to step out to private agencies, to work in other ways, to get what they need to survive as a human being.
Hmm. I've been working very closely with the federal chief nursing office, and in the coming weeks, they're going to be releasing a nurse retention strategy. And this is something that we created as a group from across the country and through all the federal agencies that have nursing. And the bottom line was that yes, money is important, but it's more about the work environment and more about the respect that nurses have earned and deserve in regards to their own lives and their work-life balance. Work-life balance is incredibly important, and especially in the mental health and emotional um, well-being of nurses, and that is it's I would argue it's almost even more important than the actual wages.
Wow, those are strong words because sometimes people assume that it's all about just the money, but it's not. It's about feeling respected, feeling seen, feeling valued, feeling a part of the team, and feeling safe. It's about feeling psychologically and physically safe and having some autonomy and feeling like someone's listening.
Absolutely. If you go into your shift knowing that your level of function is, going to be so overwhelming that you are potentially putting patient safety at risk, would you go into that workplace? Would you feel comfortable going into that workplace? I would, I would say from myself, I would say no. I would leave. And what would that do? That would actually make it even worse because the people that are staying, my colleagues, have to pick up the slack. So it is a vicious cycle, and it's something that the the governments need to look at. It's not just throwing money at the problem; it's about fixing the system as a whole.
Wow.
Well, I think you really, in bringing in the upcoming nursing retention toolkit from Dr. Lee Chapman's leadership as a federal CNO, that both Val and I have been involved in developing. There are solutions that nurses have put on the table for decades, and we have solutions today to the kinds of problems that we're up against. We know what we need to be well at work and to provide excellent nursing care to patients, families, and communities. And we also have, again, a fantastic national report, Sustaining Nursing in Canada, that articulates activities that employers, nurses, governments can undertake to address the kinds of problems that are facing nursing today and facing the healthcare system as a result of its impact on nursing. So it's not without hope. There's lots of opportunity for change. Um, and I'll also add that in that spirit, I must give credit for the context in British Columbia, and particularly to my colleagues at the BC Nurses Union and the Nursing Policy Secretariat in the government of BC, regarding their work around legislating some of the pieces that have been identified in national reports that will be supportive of nursing. So, for example, in the most recent collective agreement that BCNU negotiated, it includes things like legislated nurse-patient ratios. British Columbia is the first jurisdiction in Canada to legislate the number of patients that a nurse will be able to care for in certain types of care areas. Another piece that came out in this incredible piece of negotiation was the creation of shift exchange pools where 6 nurses can come together and create a shift exchange pool where they can regularly swap and have shift flexibility without without that micromanaging level of approval that's required. So these are the kinds of concrete, demonstrable infrastructure steps that can be taken to lift some of these pressures off nursing, to improve the context of care and the context of work. And I have to raise my hands to folks in BC for taking those steps. And I hope the rest of the country follows.
The rest of the country is in envy, that's for sure.
Right?
Wow. Okay. So I didn't even know that these things were happening. Around when did this happen? Right now we're in November of 2023. When did this happen, Angela?
Yeah, so to the best of my knowledge, these changes were announced earlier this year as BCNU completed its negotiation. You may know that there was a significant period of negotiations for many unions in BC, and BCNU was one of them. And so those were announced earlier this year.
So one of them is kind of a protection around workload, around the ratio, like as a nurse, how many patients do I have to juggle in my mind at one time? How many lives do I have in my hands to take care of at one time? Something that's reasonable. And I'm sure it differs from ward to ward, from acuity to acuity on the spectrum. And the other one is giving more power to the grassroots to be more flexible around their scheduling. And you said to reduce the micromanaging or meddling of shift shift changes. I'd like to explore a little bit more. What is some of that? What are some of those barriers to flexible shifts? Because for some people in other work contexts, they're like, you just make a agreement with someone and just swap the shift, no big deal. Like, what are some of those structural or historical structures that make shift swapping so challenging? If you could speak to that.
Val, do you want to hop in first from your rural
No,
remote?
I'm gonna give that one to you because my shift swapping is different than yours. So
Well, and I think that really speaks to the challenge of answering the question, is it varies by employer, it varies by jurisdiction. There are some, there are many nurses who work in unionized environments. There are many nurses who do not. And so they work with private enterprise, or they work in other forms of the healthcare system. So it varies by workplace. It varies by the rules within those workplaces. But I would say generally, because we are an essential service, there are moments in the course of a year, for example, that are considered, high intensity periods for the system, where staffing levels need to be guaranteed and they need to be secure. And so in those periods of time, there are limits to the number of nurses in a pool of employees who can be away. And so managers and leaders will manage the amount of time that someone can be away, or how many nurses can be away during those periods. And that's, again, that's a very reasonable thing. And nurses are very comfortable with that. The challenge comes, for example, when you have a service that has a certain number of nurses who cannot ever take the entirety of their vacation allotment, for example, in the course of the number of days of the year, because math doesn't math. You can't get 35 nurses 6 weeks a year off with those high intensity periods being covered. And so nurses, we don't get necessarily always those long stretches away to recover and recuperate. We may not be able to get those times off where we have family events coming. And all of us in healthcare, paramedics, physicians, nurses, PTs, OTs, we all accept that we provide care 24/7, 365 days a year. That's the nature of the work we've chosen to do. The difference comes in when there isn't that reprieve, and the operational demands exceed the capacity for the human beings in the system. And when you need that break, you either take that break as a mental health crisis, or you get that break because your employer allows you to take a rest. And sometimes those rests don't come, and we see what happens.
Wow. The operational demands exceed the human capacity. That is such a good descriptor of what I see going on right now. And wow. And people can't leave without leaving the job completely, because you break the rules if you take time off.
And we're experiencing that. And Val, I know you can probably speak to this as well. We are experiencing the challenges that we're up against across all 4 domains of nursing. So people don't often know that nursing is comprised of 4 domains. One is direct care provision. And so that is what most people think of when they think of a nurse. They think of you bedside, in your scrubs, providing that compassionate, caring nursing care. But nursing is also education. It's also research. It's also leadership, like the roles Val and I do every day. And we are seeing the same shortages and the same challenges for nurse educators who are trying to see an uptick in the number of nurses they graduate. There's more seats being funded, so we need more educators, but there aren't enough. So across all of those aspects of nursing and the healthcare system, we're facing those same shortages, those same challenges from one end of the input to the output.
And just to expand on that as well, it's not unique to Canada as well. Angela and I just spent a week in Switzerland at WHO, and this was something that was very profoundly talked about. The World Health Organization is cognizant that there's a global nursing shortage across all of these domains, and the groups that are feeling it the most are the countries that are often seen as the providers of nurses. For example, the Philippines, India, Nigeria. Their nursing ratios are almost worse than ours, because they are sending nurses to the West to try and help with our own nursing shortage. And so the ICN has actually put out a position statement about ethical nurse recruitment, and being able to provide the level of nursing care in those countries while being able to allow for the labor mobility across borders.
Wow. Wow. So the ICN stands for International Something of Nurses?
Council of Nurses, International Council of Nurses.
Nurses, okay. It's so interesting how you guys went to Geneva in Switzerland to discuss the same issue. Um, I'm hearing that there are issues in how our, like in British Columbia we have health authorities, and how our health authorities kind of have rules around that are sometimes not as not as flexible as they could be in order to allow our nurses to be well, to swap rules. And then Angela, you highlighted that there's something like called private agency nurses, where if I'm not happy with how the health authority is running things, I will leave and go be employed by an agency. And that agency almost creates a buffer of almost like usual safety structures, usual psychological safety and boundary structures. It's like a whole different culture. Like you exit the culture of the health authority and you enter into a typical corporate culture where people actually are allowed to have boundaries and allowed to take time off. So there's actually this add-on to the system that has developed out of a niche and a need for wellness. And but then I think you've highlighted that health authorities and governments that own the health authorities, or the ministry that runs the health authorities, could decide to make a change to become more welcoming or more safe for nurses. Did I interpret that correctly?
Absolutely. I think, nurses we have a fundamental code of ethics that guides our practice, just like many professionals do. Nursing as a profession and as a discipline is deeply, deeply, passionately behind a publicly funded healthcare system in Canada. And I am very much of the belief that nurses who are provided with flexibility, humane treatment, and safe quality practice environments, that they want to be in the service of British Columbians and Canadians in the publicly funded healthcare system. There are always nurses who will want to be entrepreneurs. There are always nurses who will do amazing, remarkable innovations, and we cheer those nurses on. But over 90% of nurses are folks who are working directly with clients, working directly with patients, who are committed to publicly funded healthcare. And so if we can create an attractive, supportive, safe environment for nurses to do their work in, where they are respected, where their knowledge and expertise is part of decision making, where they have the practice tools to enable the kind of excellent care that nurses can provide, I firmly believe nurses will show up, because we have for over a century. That is ours. That is our tradition. That is who we are.
Wow, that's powerful. So it's kind of like there are some changes that we could make as health authorities, as governing bodies who are the stewards of healthcare, to make nurses feel safer. That we don't need to create private workarounds for something. And in those privatized workarounds, these agencies that nurses can join, we end up paying a premium. We end up paying 10 to 20%, 30% more out of tax money to pay for those agency nurses to come into the public system to serve in the gaps that are left. Because
Lawrence, there's an added cost on top of that as well. Where those nurses that are going to the private agencies, where are they coming from? They're coming from the public system. And so the public system is losing that health human resource.
Yeah.
And it's coming at a cost to the public. So, it's a twofold cost.
You're paying double, triple, and premiums on top of it because we're not doing it right the first time. Wow.
And I would add that nurses need to be in spaces where they are leading nurses. So it's not about other people fixing things for nursing. It's about the system acknowledging the value and expertise of nurses and creating space for nurses to lead the kinds of solutions that we have. And right now there are structures, both in the province I work in, but across the country, that limit nurses' capacity to lead nursing. And that can't continue. right? We are self-regulating autonomous care providers. We are professionals. We have the knowledge and expertise to lead entire health systems and, of course, our own disciplinary practice.
We need to have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've been pushing for years. And the first example that I can give you is that the role of the federal chief nursing officer, which was eliminated during the Harris government in 2012, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 2012, it was eliminated, was reinstated just a year ago in August of last year. And Dr. Lee Chapman, who both Angela and I know very well, is the new federal chief nursing officer, and she is absolutely fantastic and going to be making some very positive and monumental changes from a national perspective to better the care that patients are receiving in our country.
And we have a fantastic chief nursing officer here in BC, Zach Medayashin, who's with the Nursing Policy Secretariat. And so those structures for nursing leadership across the country and within provinces and territories are critically important to not only maintain, but invest in, because that's how you get change for nursing.
Mm. So there has been a sense before that people were making rules for nurses without having nurses at the table. Yeah.
100%, yes.
Yeah.
For decades, if not centuries.
And also, you'd mentioned, Angela, that there is some new policy that allows the shift changes and that the nursing ratios. What is that policy called again, if anybody wants to look it up?
Absolutely. It's the collective agreement. I believe that the best place to find that is on the BCNU website. And you can see all that incredible work done by the nursing union here in BC. And again, raise my hands to them for that work. Extraordinary work in collective bargaining.
Okay, and other provinces have been looking at it and are envious and trying. From your feel of the pulse of your colleagues, are these new policies being enacted? Are people abiding by these policies so far?
Yeah, so with any collective agreement, it takes time, I think, to stand up the kinds of structures to support implementation. Obviously, I don't speak for BCNU, so they would be the best folks to check in about implementation. But what I can say is that having it on the horizon is giving nurses hope. Nurses are very anxious to see it made real. I hear from nurses every day who are, holding us to task, saying, where's that change? But it will take a bit of time to implement, and that's appropriate. That is an appropriate level of thoughtfulness that needs to go into making sure the public has access to care, making sure care is safe, and enabling those nurse-patient ratios, for example, to reduce workload and support nurses in excellence at work. So that will take a bit of time. Other things I'm sure in that agreement are, day one, hour zero, they're ready to roll. But it does sometimes take time for some of those larger structures to be set up, and that's kind of in the space that we're in right now. Of course, they would speak better to those pieces than I would.
So I've heard on this call so far, as we're wrapping up, that work-life balance is really important. Feeling respected is really important. Being invited to the table is important. Having some flexibility to take care of your family is important. To be present with your family, as is reasonable with any job, is important. Not having an unreasonable work volume on you is important. What else is important that we haven't discussed if we were to make some big changes to bring more nurses back into the clinical workspace? What are some big changes that we could do? What comes to mind for you, Val or Angela?
Val, I know you've got great ideas. Do you want to go first on this one?
I think a lot of it, and you've already mentioned this, is the work environment, and having that respect between colleagues and between professions is critically important. A lot of professions don't understand what other professions do in a day, basically, and so having that interprofessional relationship fostered, I think would be great. And then I think another very important thing, particularly for the new grads and younger nurses, is to have that mentorship available to them. I know going through my career, I'm a mid-career nurse now. I've been in the nursing profession for 20 years, and I cringe when I say that, 20 years. Um, but knowing that, early on in my career, I did have somebody that I could bounce ideas off of. I had nurses that had been in the system for years, and when I was having problems, I'd say, how would you handle this? And they gave me perspective that I would have never even thought of. And so having that mentorship role with a mid-career or a late-career nurse is quite important, particularly for the younger nurses. And then with regards to retention as a whole, having roles specifically for mid to late career nurses, that respects their knowledge and experience and their skills. The nurses that are approaching retirement have a wealth of knowledge, and creating roles for them, whether it's a senior professorship or some sort of other type of role, that will retain these nurses in the healthcare system to be able to provide that support throughout the entire sort of trajectory of the nursing workforce. So supporting those mid to late career nurses as they transition into retirement. And I know a lot of nurses who have retired don't necessarily want to leave nursing, and so there's opportunities to capitalize on their knowledge and their experience in other ways, whether it's through volunteerism or through different projects that they could manage. And so encouraging those projects to be developed for these nurses at the varying stages in their career.
What I'm hearing you say, Val, is that there is a lot of talent out there that's untapped, and that we have to
Yes.
continue to see that and choose to see those strengths out there and leverage those assets for the
Very much
betterment
so.
of our communities. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, very, very much so.
I mean,
Anything?
Val, you know that I am, Lawrence, that you may not know this, but I am a policy nurse. That's how I spend my days. I practice specifically focused on policy. And so, to Val's excellent points around mid to late career roles and the importance of mentorship, I would add things like attending to multi-jurisdictional licensure. So right now, nurses who want to be mobile, who want to take up a secondment or temporary assignment in from BC to Manitoba, for example, if there's a high needs area, they're restricted by licensure in doing that. So having more agreements for nurses to be mobile across the country, where their license in British Columbia is recognized in other provinces and territories, I think is a critical step. And we've seen the Canadian Medical Association for Physicians really champion that idea of national licensure. And so I think that's a conversation we can add nurses to and think about what mobility for Canadian nurses looks like. I also
And
think it's
it can
really,
also
oh,
help,
sorry, I'll go ahead.
and we can also, ask our physician colleagues who are championing this for their own profession to, to support the nurses in this regard as well. It's what's good for one
Absolutely.
profession would be just as good for the other profession.
Absolutely. And I think, opportunities for nurses to see themselves in a full career arc across the system. So, if you are a nurse and you want to move into academia, if you're a nurse and you want to move into clinical nurse specialist roles in a particular area of practice, provide those career pathways for nurses where they can see themselves staying from entry to practice all the way through retirement and post-retirement work as well. That arc of trajectory for a nurse is sometimes hard to see beyond the bedside, and we need more pathways for nurses to experience their whole career in the publicly funded sector. And then the last thing that I would add that I think is really critically important is data. We've seen an emphasis from the federal government in the provincial, territorial, federal conversations about bilateral agreements, really focused on the necessity of healthcare data. And that extends to workforce data. And so other folks who I will echo have called for a national workforce strategy in healthcare. I think that would be an excellent idea. But the use of actual data of who our workforce is, who our nurses are, where they are, and some reasonable forecasting and capacity to match nursing resources to population need is something we're really missing in the system. So if I can make my plug for workforce data, that's my plug.
Wow, yeah. So having data informed staffing. Yeah. And are there models that you know of that are already doing that, maybe on a smaller scale?
Yeah, there's a few. We certainly have some folks we can look to. There's nothing new under the sun, and human beings are brilliant. So chances are there's some good pockets we can steal good ideas from.
Mm. So we've covered a lot of topics today, and I really want to thank you, Angela, and thank you, Val, for coming on the call today. Before I stop the recording, and I just want to ask if there's anything else you'd like the audience to know.
I just want to thank you, Lawrence, for having this conversation exclusively focused on nursing. I appreciate that space to talk about the uniqueness of who nurses are and the care that we bring to people, to Canadians, to British Columbians in my instance, and to surface some of the challenges that we're up against, but also some of the real solutions that we can put on the table. So I want to express my gratitude to you, and I hope what your listeners hear is that nurses are in this. This is our life, this is our work. We are here for the long haul to make sure Canadians are healthy, to make sure Canadians are well. We want to be part of the solutions, and we have the knowledge and expertise to lead in these spaces.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that nurses are much more than just a body at the bedside. We have knowledge, skills, and abilities that we can put forth into the care that we give. And nurses, you don't find them just in the hospitals. I've worked as a flight nurse. I've worked as a cruise ship nurse. I work in disasters. It's not just nursing at the bedside. There are infinite number of different places where you can find nurses. And those nurses are the ones that you need to tap into to get the knowledge to change the system for the better.
So diverse inclusion when we're trying to plan a strategy. Yeah. Thank you, Val. And if anybody wants to connect with either of you to learn more, continue the discussion, ask you more questions, how might they do that? Angela, do you have some type of social media that might reach out to
I
you?
am just a Google away. It's not hard. So yeah, chuck my name into Google, you'll find me.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, as Relief Nurse.
Relief Nurse. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been an amazing chat. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Lawrence.